Hello, good evening, everybody. So tonight's topic is going to be about thin bones, or osteoporosis. Now, before someone gets to the point of osteoporosis, they tend to develop thinner bones or softer bones called osteopenia. So osteopenia usually is a few years before someone gets all the way to osteoporosis. So it's important to learn how to prevent this thin bones, because thin bones are one of the leading causes of disability in the United States, and a highly predictable cause for decline of life and for having to go into nursing homes, and quite frankly, after a first hip fracture or something, the rates of mortality definitely goes up. In other words, can be a harbinger of worser things to come. So highly advised to do everything you can to prevent this from happening in the first place, so that you can live out your old age with health and vitality, and being able to be as mobile and independent as possible. So osteoporosis, so bones that are becoming thin and light and airy, which they're not supposed to do. They won't need to be, dense. It's a kind of a metabolic disease, and just that progressive thinning effect of on the core nature of the bone, that part that makes it thick and hard and strong to be able to support our weight. And basically, you can go into the details of how does it happen. The bones the cells that make bone versus the cells that degrade the bone, they're kind of in this little balance. And when the kind of bone cells that degrade the bone win, well, then the bone tends to get thin because it's being degraded, essentially. But there's a few different kinds of causes that, in addition to the very common form of the disease. So, for example, the primary just reflects the natural hormone and metabolic changes. For example, for many women, menopause is very commonly right before the bones start to really get thin. But secondary means that it's caused by some other disease. So there's a bunch of diseases that can cause thinning of the bones. For example, the parathyroids. So the thyroid gland is down here in the neck, and there's these little tiny glands that sit on top of it called the parathyroid glands. And when they get too active, it can degrade the bones. When the vitamin D levels are very low, it can make those parathyroid glands hyperactive, and again, push in the direction of that as well. So if the thyroid gland itself is too active, that can cause it as well. Diabetes, chronic kidney disease, liver disease, some of those malabsorption syndromes. So if somebody has to have surgery on the gut for some reason, or has any number of conditions that can cause the gut to just not be able to absorb the vitamins and the minerals and the nutrients as well as usual. Pancreatic insufficiency, so those folks who have pancreas problems and their pancreas just isn't able to work as well as usual, high risk for thin bones later in life. And certain medications can do it as well. In addition to that, there's a few other risk factors. Being female is very higher risk. So once women go through menopause, the risk goes up as the age goes up. But it's not just for women. Men also, especially after age 70, have a higher risk for bone fractures as well. As I mentioned, that primary osteoporosis, where it's just a reflection of the hormonal and other changes over time, 6 times more common in women than in men. And also the osteoporosis tends to begin earlier and gets more severe in women. Women or people in general who are thinner also might have thinner bones as well. And if you happen to be a little bit on the heavier side, the extra weight reduces the risk. So one of the ways to reduce the risk is just weight-bearing exercise. Is one of the most common things that we as physicians tell people, things like dancing and running and basically carrying loads, anything that creates weight on the skeleton. Doing things like couch surfing and lying in bed are absolutely the opposite. So, so get moving, stay active. Sedentary lifestyle, again, sitting on the couch. Genetics, so there tends to be some predispositions. So, for example, just as a globalization, the folks that are Caucasian and Asian tend to be at higher risk than those that have the African heritage on them, or the Latinos have some protective genetic background. Generally speaking, the African Americans have had greater bone densities and a lower risk of fracture. However, when the fractures do occur in that population, it tends to be higher morbidity and mortality. In other words, rougher consequences is a way of saying it compared to the others. So anyway, so just genes like who are your parents and great-grandparents and all that can lead a risk. So if you've got a family member who has had thin bones, or that dowager's hump, which happens when basically the bones in the upper spine up here fracture. So you're leaning over a little bit, and then the bones very slightly fracture, and then they remold and fuse, and that creates the forward curve. I'm trying to exaggerate just to demonstrate it, called the dowager's hump, which is seen in many caricatures of older women where they're kind of hunched over and they can't straighten up because the bones fuse that way. So keeping a good posture and keeping your bones strong will help keep that from happening. So previous fracture in the adult years, so a sign of early issues. Smoking, huge risk factor. Staying away from tobacco is amazingly strong way of causing your bones to be stronger. So I'll just jump over to that part for a second. But basically, I think they were saying it was about 30-something percent higher risk of having fractures and stuff if somebody continues to use tobacco. All right, so anyway, so basically good diet and exercise can be very useful for preventing this. There we go. Smoking increases the lifetime risk of a hip fracture. Now that's one of the most disabling kinds of fractures. Hi, good to see you too. Basically, one of the highest kinds of fractures is the hip fracture. Very disabling, very traumatic. So smoking increases the lifetime risk by 31% in women and 40% in men, and increases the lifetime risk for the spine fracture, the vertebral fracture, by 13% in women and 32% in men. So especially for the guys, I mean, for pretty much everybody, I always recommend staying away from tobacco, but here's just one more reason to stay away from tobacco if you want to keep your bones from having trouble. So, of course, once you quit, the risk goes down, but you don't really observe a benefit for about 10 years. So, the earlier you get away from that stuff, the better for the long-term health. So, there's a few medications that are particularly troublesome for the bones. Steroids. So people with autoimmune conditions that need to take steroids on a regular basis, very high risk for fractures, probably should be talking to the doctors about getting early screenings. Maybe instead of waiting till age 65, which is kind of the universal screening time for ADEXA for folks maybe a little bit earlier, cyclosporin and methotrexate. So cancer, chemotherapy types of drugs do raise that risk of bone fractures. Other medications, vitamin A supplements, heparin, antacids that contain aluminum, so that's a lot of those over-the-counter versions. Some of the antidepressants, some of the anticonvulsants, medroxyprogesterone, tend to increase the risk for osteoporosis. And then there's a few drugs that are a little bit protective. So the thiazide diuretics, the estrogens, and the androgens. So basically those sex hormones. So sometimes one of the benefits of having some estrogen-containing compounds in the menopausal, perimenopausal state is it does increase the bone density just a little bit there. Watching out for alcohol. So high alcohol intake is also associated with more fractures as well. So a low or moderate alcohol intake with reduced risk. Having children, so those that don't have children are at higher risk. If menopause comes early, it also is higher risk, again, because the estrogen levels and everything kind of shift around menopause. Low calcium, low vitamin D over time. And then again, these comorbid diseases, so rheumatoid arthritis, kidney disease, diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, and those just have a mixture of everything. Some of the drugs that are used to treat them, the conditions themselves, and then the malabsorption. All of that can kind of coalesce into causing a higher risk. So diagnosis, we see it sometimes in patients. They might do something that really ought not to cause a fracture. The next thing you know, they're having a fragility fracture. And so you can see it sometimes when you're doing an x-ray. The radiologist will comment, ooh, that does not look as robust as it really ought to. And they'll comment the bones look osteopenic. And then you look at the DEXA scan. They measure different areas and are able to kind of quantify how far gone you are in those areas. So we do different kinds of blood tests and stuff to just rule out those secondary factors. Treatment. So I don't want to go a lot into the treatment methods just in this brief video, because that really is going to be an individualized conversation between you and your physician. But just to give some general overviews, as with everything medicine, prevention is far better than a cure. Because our medicines are imperfect, and not having the problem in the first place is generally better if you can help it. So getting enough calcium tends to be that the plant sources of calcium tend to be better absorbed by the body. There's a couple of things to consider with getting enough calcium. For example, there were some studies that showed if you got it from pills or supplements, in people with a certain degree of fracture risk, it reduced the fracture risk. But on the other hand, the pill version, the calcium horse pills, we call them because they're usually pretty big, then those can raise the risks of strokes and heart attacks as well. So it's one of these individual balancing factors. I'll put the links underneath in case someone wants to dive in and kind of read a little bit more about that decision process. And then basically staying away from anything that can cause a fall is vitally important. So for a while in medicine, we used to have a debate, which comes first, the fall or the fracture. So for a while, the fracture people were winning, and they'd say, oh, well, you're just standing there minding your business, and then your hip just kind of breaks on you, and then you fall to the ground. And then there was another group that was saying, no, you trip on something and that puts the extra weight on the hip and that causes the crack to happen. Generally speaking, whichever way it is in reality for most folks, avoiding falls is paramount. So basically looking over the house, looking for tripping hazards, watching out for those little rugs that kind of go slip underneath you, watching out for tile floors and other things that might be a slipping fall hazard. Installing handrails in areas that might not have them. The bathtub is actually one of the most common places for people to fall, so sometimes having those little extra rails, as a safety measure, just to be on the safe side, because the last thing you want is to fall and hit your head or break a hip or something in these locations. So just as general safety measures. Of course, weight-bearing resistance exercise. A few years ago, I listened to a beautiful podcast by a physician that was recommending their patients wear a weight vest. And the thing that was neat about that was that they were able to show that the subsequent DEXA scans, the bone density measuring scans, actually improved with the dedicated weight thing. So the weight vest basically is something that you put little weights in, start off with 1 or 2 pounds, and gradually can increase it to whatever the weight vest has on it. But that's a kind of a nice way of doing an axial load, basically loading the whole body, as opposed to just trying to lift weights. We're talking about whole body, because the big ones you want to worry about are basically the legs and stuff. So that was an interesting thing. Another one that they recommended is strengthening the core muscles and basically practicing the balance. Again, these were recommendations to reduce the falls, because the falls can cause the fractures. Of course, staying away from tobacco, we mentioned, again, can't emphasize that enough. That stuff is just really, really rough on the body. So as far as the medications goes, there's been a few kind of pendulum swings a little bit as far as medications. We used to throw everybody on these, what they're called bisphosphonates, in the hopes that they would strengthen the bones. And then after a while, we discovered, if you leave someone on those for too long, then it makes the bones more fragile, which kind of defeats the point. So basically, the idea is that there's a certain number of years that they would recommend taking it and then stop. The trouble with those medications is it can cause a lot of heartburn and sometimes basically esophagitis, basically kind of wearing away at that esophagus and inflaming it. Then there's a few others that are out there that are kind of newer, estrogen receptor modulars and calcitronin, and for the men, some testosterone. Again, this just weighing and balancing the risks of basically, if there's an occult prostate cancer, you throw a bunch of testosterone on it, you can potentially push those hormone-sensitive cancers in a direction with it. So again, really good for you to have these conversations with your primary care physician and figure out what is right for you. Those thiazides, that's the hydrochlorothiazide, there's a few others out there as well. Basically, the reason that the thiazides are sometimes used in folks that will help strengthen the bones, or maybe slow down or help prevent the thinning of the bones, is because a lot of times when we're losing our calcium, we're just peeing it out. And so the kidneys are losing the calcium, and that category of drugs helps the body to keep the calcium instead of basically pee it out. So the trouble with them is that they can sometimes in the summertime make it more likely for the electrolytes to swing or people to kind of faint with it. So in general, when you're looking at the rates of where do people get this thin bones, it tends to be a disease that's more common or more prevalent in Western societies or where Western diets are very common. And so the thing that's interesting is that there's a lot of focus on the amount of calcium that people are eating, and yet in America and other Western societies, people are having a lot of calcium in the form of like dairy products, for example, and yet they're also having a lot of osteoporosis and osteopenia. So whereas some other places where the diet's more centered around whole foods and plants and things like that, there may be a much lower amount of the calcium, and yet the bones are, better, stronger, that sort of thing. So there's some studies who are trying to figure out, well, why is that? So maybe it's the meats, the soft drinks, the fried foods, the desserts, all those refined grains and things like that. Again, not good for the body in other ways. But when you're having more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and beans, especially the legumes or beans, they tend to be associated with better bone density and lower fracture risk. So Anyway, so there's some thinking where people are trying to figure out, well, why is that all going on, and haven't quite panned out on all of that yet. But in general, increased fruit and vegetable intake is associated with better bone and mineral density and less fracture risk in both men and women. So having one or fewer servings of fruits and vegetables, 40% greater risk for hip fracture compared to people who have 3 to 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. So basically, eat your fruits and vegetables. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line with a lot of this stuff. So watching out for sodium. So basically, when you're having a high sodium diet, the sodium gets peed out and it kind of like drags the calcium along with it. So basically, there's some inkling that maybe having a high sodium diet might be very bad for the bones. And generally speaking, again, watching out for the saturated fat for the bones as well. So moderation in caffeine, there's a kind of a thing. So if someone is having 8 cups of coffee a day, there was a 54% higher risk in women that had 8 cups a day compared to those that had a lower amount. But for men, the highest level of coffee consumption was protective for the bones, like a 25% lower risk. So there's some interesting things going on with coffee and fracture risk that is kind of a mixed bag that might be worth looking at in the future. Again, watching out for alcohol. And the thing with alcohol, and you might be wondering, okay, so I know alcohol causes all these cancers, liver damage, all this other trouble with the body, but it also has hormonal effects on the body. And one of the hormones that sometimes the doctors will use at treatment, calcitonin, name's not that important, but basically it's a hormone that keeps the bone strong. So the alcohol interferes with this hormone that keeps your bones strong. And so when folks are having over 50 grams a day in particular, it was associated with a higher hip fracture risk again. So anyway, so keeping away from or at least moderating the alcohol intake. Supplemental vitamin A is another one that can be problematic when you're having it in the synthetic form. If you're having the vitamin A from plant sources such as orange and yellow vegetables like sweet potatoes and orange and red bell peppers and other natural forms like carrots, for example, when the body takes those things in, basically it converts exactly what it needs and it does not disrupt the hormones of the physiology. So getting those in their natural form is better than the pill version of that. And then watching out for calcium and vitamin D. Again, the supplemental, women that took both calcium and vitamin D supplements had 30% lower risk of hip fracture and 15% lower risk of fractures in general compared to folks that did not take any calcium and vitamin D. And sometimes with little kids that are taking steroids, their bones are thin at a young age, and so those were helpful for strengthening the bones. And sometimes they're antiretrovirals, so for example, folks who are on HIV treatments and some of the chronic hepatitis treatments and so forth, and then some of the anti-epileptic drugs. So they found that a little bit extra supplementation was helpful for strengthening the bones in those cases. All right, so almost done with this section. So vitamin K, again, this is very helpful. You're going to find a lot of vitamin K in the dark green leafy vegetables in particular. So basically broccoli, spinach, romaine, lettuce is very helpful for keeping the bones strong as well. So generally speaking, bottom parts are low sodium diet. All that extra salt that's added to our diet is just not good for our physiology when it comes to the bone strength. Watching out for over caffeinating and over alcoholing, I guess. So, and then for female patients with thin bones, total calcium intake from diet and supplements of about 1,500 milligrams a day, not all at once, but kind of split up through the day. And Dr. Barnard's group was recommending 800 international units of vitamin D. Some of the studies that Dr. Greger recommends in general is more like 2,000 units or 1,000 units of vitamin D per day for health and longevity. So, somewhere in that neighborhood, somewhere between 800 and 2,000 of vitamin D. So staying away from tobacco, of course, key for everything in health. And then, of course, weight-bearing exercises as appropriate, given that a lot of Americans and other folks have chronic back pain or other hip issues. Those soft bones tend to be associated with osteoarthritis, wear and tear arthritis. And so some of the weight-bearing activity can be challenging. So working with a physical therapist, working with your primary care team can be helpful to find something that you can do, even if it's just as simple as getting one of those weight vests and very gradually increasing it on there. Alrighty, and then a little bit more from Dr. Greger's website, talking about with their summary of the plant-based sources of calcium, for example, kale and broccoli. The calcium is absorbed twice as well as the calcium that's in the cow's milk. And so even though the folks that have a more omnivorous or mixed diet have over twice as much calcium, because basically yogurt and cheese and ice cream and all that kind of stuff all has some calcium in it, they found that the folks that were plant-based didn't need to worry about that because other protective factors, the bones seem to be the same strength. Soy milk, if the soy milk is shaken up, has about the same amount of calcium as cow's milk, and it's not a coincidence. They know that this is one of the reasons why people drink milk, so they're matching for it and tend to have as much or sometimes a little bit more. And then, again, we're talking about the protein intake. Some people were theorizing that if you eat meat, then it's acidic, and then that, dissolves the bones or something. But when we tried to test for that, really there wasn't any credible way of showing that was happening. So, again, people have a lot of ideas, but the point of medicine, the point of research is to test those ideas and to see which ones hold out over time, and testing, of course. But again, AGEs, those are advanced basically byproducts of some of our dietary habits. I think I'll probably do a video on AGEs one of these days. And then again, talking about coffee consumption, a little bit of a mixed bag as far as the coffee consumption. So anyway, so that's all I've got for you guys today about preventing osteoporosis. Hopefully you learned a little bit, and I'll have the links to those references that I was reviewing with you in at the end, as well as a couple of additional references for more in-depth learning. So take care. It's good to say hi to you guys again, and have a good evening. Stay strong. Bye-bye.